These strips that I just demonstrated are bias strips, and they work very nicely on curved areas. The strips that I made for the quilt are on the straight grain because our quilt has very straight edges. I cut these 1.5 inches wide and the length and width of the quilt the whole way around. To begin your binding, turn under approximately 1/4 inch before you pin down and begin sewing. You want to make sure that you pin through all 3 layers of the fabric and the binding included. So you're actually pinning 4 layers together. After you have your binding pinned in place, position it under the needle and presser foot, lower your needle, and backstitch 1 or 2 stitches. Continue sewing 1/4 inch around the binding edge. As you come to the end, make sure you overlap the binding approximately 1 inch. Back tack and remove from your machine. Trim the binding now close to where you ended your stitching. Once again, you're going to want to return to your ironing board and press the seam allowance of the binding to the outside towards the binding. You'll then want to press under 1/4 inch and then press the binding to the back of the quilt. This is what creates your bound edge. Pin this in place and then we'll be ready to stitch again. After pressing your binding, you want to pin in place. Once again, we're going to stitch in the ditch. Place the fabric under the presser foot and lower your needle right into the seam. Again, you'll just take 1 or 2 stitches and 1 and 2 stitches to back tack. Continue sewing, being very careful to stitch in the ditch. What you're doing when you're stitching is catching the binding in the back as well as stitching in the ditch on the front. When you get to the corner, carefully lower the needle into the corner, raise the presser foot, and pivot. Continue sewing down the other side. We now have the binding sewn on all 4 sides. We almost have our quilt completed. At this point, you may want to take the template and add a decorative stitch along the border. Position the template, use your chalk pencil, and draw your lines. I'm just going to use the center line in this template. Reposition your template until you've reached the end of the border. Place your quilt back under the sewing machine and stitch along the white chalk line. You need to sew slowly to turn the corners and curves to follow the line. Be sure to stop and reposition your quilt so you don't have any bunching and gathering while you're stitching. You want to use your damp cloth again to take out the chalk marks. Believe it or not, we finished our quilt. It wasn't that difficult, was it? A quilt sleeve is a great way to display your newly created masterpiece. Once the sleeve is attached to the back of your quilt, simply insert a section of lattice into the sleeve and your quilt is ready to be hung anywhere. Let's see how the sleeve is constructed. To create a sleeve for your quilt, cut a piece of fabric 10 inches wide and the width of your quilt. Add 1/2 inch on each end for a seam allowance. Press under the seam allowance on each end. Take the piece and place it with right sides together lengthwise. Set your sewing machine for a straight stitch and stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Lower your needle, take several stitches, back tack, and continue to sew. When you reach the end, back tack once again, then remove the fabric from the machine. Go back to your ironing board and press the seam allowance to one side. Then turn right sides out. Position the sleeve at the top edge of your quilt. Pin in place at the top and bottom. Hand stitch in place also through the back and the batting, but be sure not to go through to the front. When it's hand stitched in place, you're ready to insert a wooden lattice and hang the quilt on the wall. I'd like to now show you some applique techniques. Applique can add a very interesting effect to the quilts that you're constructing. Notice on this quilt, we have applique with straight stitching along the outside. This is the same piece with just the applique and no straight stitching. Look at the different effects that you can create. We're going to construct some pot holders. The first pot holder will have applique with satin stitching, and the second one, applique with a blind hem stitch. I've cut my fabric to the size of the potholder that I'd like, and then I've cut my applique pieces. I have webbing fused to the back of the applique piece. This makes it easy when you're trying to stitch around each piece. Let's move over to the machine and do some satin stitching and some blind hem stitching around our applique pieces. The first type of applique I'm going to show you is the blind hem stitch applique. Most of the time you'll use a transparent thread with this technique. That way it will actually be a blind stitch and you'll just see the applique piece. You'll need to lower your presser foot and lower your needle just into the edge of the fabric between the applique and the base fabric. You're going to start by taking several stitches. You want the straight stitch to run right along the edge of the applique piece and the zigzag stitch to jump over into the applique piece. The secret is to guide so you barely see the stitches. Even with me using red thread in my needle, it's very difficult to see the stitches, and that's the effect that you want to get. You just see the applique, not the stitching. The other type of applique stitching is using your satin stitch. The satin stitch is at a zigzag that's very close together. The difference between this and your blind hem stitches, you definitely will see your satin stitches. This gives you an interesting effect and more of a three-dimensional effect to your applique. Once again, you're going to place the fabric under the presser foot and lower your presser foot so the needle is again hitting right in the center between the applique and your base fabric. Begin to sew so that the needle is going halfway onto the applique and halfway out to the fabric. Slowly stitch and pivot. You can see I'm gently moving the fabric and pivoting it as I'm sewing. See the difference? You can really see the stitches on this one. When I hold them up together, you can see the blind hem and the satin stitch. To now construct our potholders, create fabric loops and attach to the top corners of the apple pieces. Place under the presser foot and straight stitch, back stitching several times. Now take your back fabric and place your front apple fabric face down. Then place a layer of batting on the bottom. So the layers you will have are your batting, your backing, and your front fabric. Pin it in place and then straight stitch. Be sure to leave an opening for turning. Use a 1/4 inch seam allowance and begin to sew. Leave your needle down, raise your presser foot, and pivot when you reach the corner. Once again, at the second corner, lower your needle, raise your presser foot, and pivot the fabric. When you reach the bottom again, backstitch and pull the fabric out. To prevent bulky corners, trim the seam allowance across the bottom. Now turn your potholder right side out. Take your potholder to the ironing board and press the seams flat. Also, gently press under your lower edge where you had turned and hand stitch in place. If you'd like to add extra embellishment to your potholder, you can now straight stitch approximately 1/4 of an inch out to add another dimension. Place the fabric underneath your presser foot and use the foot as a guide to straight stitch around the applique. Lower your needle and pivot when you reach a corner. You've now finished your creative applique potholders. If your sewing machine has decorative stitches built into it, you may want to experiment and see the beautiful effects you can create. On the Christmas stocking, there are decorative stitches to create a crazy quilt effect. On the placemat and napkin, a feather stitch has been used. I'll continue sewing the feather stitch on the inside of the placemat. Lower the presser foot so it's centered between the two pieces of fabric. Set your machine for a feather stitch, lower your needle, and begin to sew. Take some time and experiment with the decorative stitches in your machine and see the interesting effects you can create. We've discussed a lot of exciting ideas and techniques today for quilting. We talked about applique, using the blind hem stitch as well as the satin stitch. We discussed using templates. We also put a wonderful quilt together. Here are some other helpful hints for displaying and storing your quilts. As I mentioned before, quilts are no longer just for the bed. Today you will find them displayed as works of art on tables, couches, and the walls. To display a quilt on the wall, you will need to distribute the weight evenly using a fabric sleeve like the one we created earlier in this video. This will prevent stress on the fibers of the quilt fabric. If you decide to display the quilt as a tablecloth, you may want to have a piece of glass or plexiglass cut to the size of the tabletop. This will prevent staining. Imagination is your only limitation when displaying your latest quilting projects. Whether draped over a chair, used as an accent on a mantle, or shown on a stand as a beautiful decorator touch, quilts are a welcome addition to any room. Great care should be taken when cleaning your quilt. The frequency of cleaning largely depends upon how your quilt is used. Quilts that are used on beds or sofas should be laundered as infrequently as possible to prevent fabric damage and fading. Quilts displayed as wall hangings are best cleaned by vacuuming or using light shaking to remove any accumulated dust. Vacuuming is a great way to clean quilts. Not only is it a gentle way to keep quilts looking their best, it makes the periods between washing your quilts much longer. When you vacuum a quilt, simply lay it flat on a padded surface and vacuum it gently with an upholstery brush attachment on low power. Again, wash your quilt only when absolutely necessary to avoid undue stress on the fabric. Be sure to hand wash your quilt using the mildest soap available. Thoroughly rinse until all the soap residue is gone. Leftover soap can dull the color of the material. To dry the quilt, lay flat and air dry. Hanging quilts is not recommended due to the water weight pulling and stretching the fabric, seams, and batting. Some quilts can be machine dried, but in general, automatic dryers will cause shrinkage and exert stress on seams and fabric. When storing a quilt, it's best to lay it flat on a bed. Believe it or not, quilts receive more damage from storage than from use. Fading, fabric deterioration, and creasing are some of the ways a quilt can be damaged. To prevent fading and fabric deterioration, keep the quilt out of direct sunlight. Before storing a quilt, consider padding the folds with acid-free tissue paper or unbleached cotton fabric that has been washed and thoroughly dried. This method of storage will help prevent permanent creasing. Also remember not to stack other items on top of a folded quilt. Putting weight and pressure on the folded edge may weaken or break the fibers. Occasionally change the fold lines by refolding the quilt. After the quilt has been carefully folded and wrapped in tissue paper or washed muslin, store it in a clean, dry location. This will prevent staining and mold and mildew. We at Singer Sewing Company hope this video has inspired you to create your own wonderful quilt projects. This video is meant as an introduction to quilting. Many of the techniques shown here can be applied to countless variations of quilting projects. Now that you have learned these basics, expand your horizons by learning more about quilting. Check your local library or bookstore for books about quilting. You may also find local quilt clubs and classes in your area. And as always, the internet has a wealth of information. We hope you have enjoyed quick and easy quilting. Happy quilting from Singer Sewing Company.